The key turned in the lock, but the notice was already taped to the door, a red-inked HOA violation demanding I remove the garden evict the people helping me and pay fines that would eat the last of my savings. My daughter's little pencil box sat on the kitchen table under that same notice. I bought this house with everything I had, and the neighborhood board tried to take it from me 2 weeks later. My name is Michael Bennett. I'm a single dad. I bought a rundown place on the edge of Greenwood Estates because I had to, because my daughter Lily deserved a backyard, a roof that stayed over her head, a future that wasn't living out of boxes. Greenwood Estates has rules. A president on its letterhead, Patricia Whitman. Pat to half the street, and a clipboard, a pocket full of bylaws, and a kind of conscience that likes to make other people pay for messes she didn't create. I expected a few letters, maybe a polite warning about paint colors. I did not expect a war. I found Maya and Nina on my second night there, 2 women living in the old barn with a wood stove burning squash in neat rows outside the kitchen window, a pot of soup on the stove. They looked like every tired person I'd been, the kind of people you don't want to look away from because you remember the shape of desperation. They said their parents had died. They'd been pushed from shelter to shelter, and when they found the broken back door, they fixed the lock and the stove and planted a few things so they wouldn't have to steal. They asked for a week. I gave them 2. I told myself I was making the best call I could. I needed help with repairs, and kids who grow up around caring people do better. It felt like the right thing. Pat didn't see it that way. She showed up at the door with a stack of complaint forms and the expression of someone who believes rules are holy scripture. "Michael," she said in front of another neighbor, "you've allowed unlawful occupancy and you're risking the safety of this community." She held up a printed excerpt from the covenants like a Bible verse. She sent an email the next morning with formal notice in the subject line. They taped a notice to my front door, unauthorized occupants, repairs without permit, remedy within 7 days. The fine schedule was stapled beneath it like a threat. For a few days, I did what most people do when the world tightens. I tried to make it all legal. I called the HOA office, filled out forms, asked about temporary permits, showed receipts, promised an inspection. The forms went to Pat's committee, which I learned slowly and painfully also meant the committee that Pat ran. She told me bluntly at a meeting over coffee and half the street watching that precedent mattered more than compassion. "If we make exceptions for you," she said, eyes on the row of chairs, "we make exceptions for everyone." She smiled, the smile of a person who thinks she's saving the neighborhood, but the way she said it made the hair on my neck stand up. Pressure builds like water behind a dam. People start to look at you differently. The neighbor next door, the one who waters the sidewalk flowers and knows everyone's business, crossed the lawn and said, "You sure you should be bringing strangers into a place with a little girl?" Lily heard that. She asked me later at the dinner table, "Are those ladies bad?" "Daddy?" And I had no answer that didn't make me feel small. My phone buzzed with more notices. Contractors backed out worried about liability and HOA complaints. The small savings I'd set aside for insulation went toward emergency permits I didn't know I'd need. I began to believe for one quiet night that the smart move was to cut my losses list. The house take what's left leave before the fines really start stacking. There's a moment in every fight where you can walk away and sleep easier. I almost took it. I sat on the porch with the notice crushed in my hand, Lily asleep inside, and I told myself the safe thing to do was to protect what little I had left. I called my sister and said, "Maybe I'm just not cut out for this." My sister said what sisters say. "You're stubborn," she said. And stubborn isn't the worst thing for a man with 1 kid and a broken roof. But stubbornness alone isn't a plan. The doubt sat heavy, though, like a coat you can't take off. What turned everything was the small, steady way people began to show up. David Morales, a retired electrician 2 blocks over, gruff, the kind of man who smells like motor oil and tells you how to hold a screwdriver, knocked on my door with a thermos and an offer. "I've been watching this, Mike. You're not doing anything crazy." He went up in the attic, checked the wiring, made notes, and then he did something that made Pat's smirk look a shade less permanent. He offered to testify to the work we'd done to check the repairs and vouch for safety. Inspector Hayes from Code Enforcement, the one who had shown up at a neighborhood meeting months earlier, agreed to an on-site visit when David vouched for us. Maya handed me a crumpled notebook full of receipts and pictures she'd been saving. "If anyone asks," she said quietly, "we have the proof." When they came, the Inspector David, the small group of neighbors who'd grown tired of Pat's sermonizing, we laid it all out. There were photos of before and after invoices for materials, stamped receipts, a ledger Maya had been keeping that would have made an accountant smile. I told the story in a voice that sounded foreign to my own ears, how I'd bought this place for Lily, how I'd made an agreement in good faith, how these women had done more than squat, they'd fixed roofs and planted food and kept a furnace running. David pointed at wiring he'd inspected and said, "This is safe. This is good work." Inspector Hayes nodded, made notes, and told me, "We'll work it out. You just need to follow process." Pat didn't like that. Her power is the kind that thrives on shadow on rules whispered in corridors. She tried to spin it. A dozen emails were produced, some thinly veiled accusations, a couple of neighbors nervous about precedent. She called another meeting, packed the room with supporters, and read complaints as if reading names from a list of sinners. Her voice rose. She accused us of breaking covenant after covenant. She wanted fines imposed immediately. She wanted to make an example. This is the part where things get loud. You can almost taste the metal of it. I'm at the mic because after all the letters and the waiting, sometimes there's only one instrument left that carries, and I say what I have to say. I don't shout. I tell the truth. I hand Inspector Hayes a folder, receipts, photos, David's statement, the ledger. Maya and Nina stand as my witnesses. David speaks up from the back. A few neighbors, not many, but enough, say they've seen the work. The lights fixed, the garden kept better than the HOA's own irrigation. Then, the thing I will replay in my head for years. A printed email turns out to have a forged signature, an instruction to look for violations that looks very much like it was written to create a paper trail. The signature matches the HOA admin's, but when she testifies, she swears she never wrote it, and that Pat had pressured her to find faults. Who you think God is in those moments depends on which side of the room you're sitting. On our side, mercy smelled like people who carried toolboxes and thermoses, and patience. On Pat's side, righteousness smelled like fine paper and form letters. The board calls for a vote, and in a storm of raised hands and murmurs, the motion to suspend Pat's executive privileges passes. The room holds its breath. Pat sits down very slowly, the color gone from her face like someone pulled the sun behind a cloud. She tries to speak, but the meeting minutes the inspector's note. David's testimony, they're a stack of evidence taller than her accusations. The board votes to rescind enforcement until permits can be properly issued and, crucially, to open a review into the way complaints are processed. There's a moment the camera of your mind catches it where Pat's mouth opens and closes. It's not victory. It's the precise, soft sound of someone who's had the rug pulled. Not a dramatic fall because this isn't a movie about righteous mob justice. It's quieter, bureaucratic. She's stripped of the microphone, handed her own paperwork, and asked to step aside while the board resets the rules she bent for years. I don't gloat. There's no gloating scene. The high point is the turning of a chair, a gavel that no longer points at us. The verdict reads like a permission to keep living violations, put on hold, fines rescinded pending proper review, and a note in the minutes that the HOA must follow its own bylaws before punishing residents. I stand on my porch later that night with the notice in my hand. It's been removed from the door. The red ink looking ridiculous in the streetlight, and Lily presses a small crayon drawing into my palm. She draws 4 stick figures and a house. Above them, she writes in shaky letters, "Our home." I feel relief, sure, but what I mostly feel is tired. The fight didn't feel like it ended with a party. It ended with a meeting room and documentation. It ended with people stepping forward. It ended with the quiet undoing of a system that had been allowed to run unchecked. There's no triumphant montage. There's no slow-motion hug. The last thing you need to hear from me is this authority is a tool. It can protect, but it can also be used to wound. If you see someone being pushed out by the rules someone else wrote, stand up, document what you can find, the people who know how to build something lawful and honest. Speak, even if your voice shakes. Power can be taken away. Justice starts with telling the truth.